Welcome to Mystery Stories, where quiet villages hide restless secrets and the smallest details speak the loudest. Here, every story unfolds gently, like a whispered confidence shared over tea, drawing you into worlds of polite conversations, watchful glances, and truths waiting patiently to be discovered. Tonight's tale invites you to listen closely to the pauses between words, to footsteps in the dark, and to the calm voice that notices what others overlook. Settle in, get comfortable, and let the mystery reveal itself slowly, because in these stories, nothing important is ever said too loudly. Chapter 1. The village liked to think of itself as a place where nothing truly startling ever happened, and so it was perhaps fitting that the cry came at a time when everyone believed themselves safely asleep. Miss Marple, however, had never been one to sleep as deeply as others claimed to do. She lay awake in the pale hour before dawn, listening to the familiar hush that settled over the rooftops when the sound drifted through her open window, brief, distant, and unmistakably human. It was not loud, nor was it prolonged, but it carried with it a sharpness that set it apart from the night birds and the sighing of the wind. Miss Marple sat up at once, her mind alert, her senses fully engaged, as though she had been expecting something just of that nature. She remained quite still, counting the seconds that followed. The village did not stir. No doors opened. No hurried footsteps echoed along the lane. Even the sound itself seemed to retreat, as though it had second thoughts about being heard at all. Miss Marple rose, wrapped her shawl about her shoulders, and peered out into the graying darkness. The houses lay silent and closed, their windows dark and uncurious. She noted with some interest that a single light glimmered faintly at the far end of the lane before it, too, was extinguished. After a moment, she returned to her bed, but sleep did not return so readily. She lay thinking how odd it was that a village so full of ears could remain so quiet after such a sound. By the time morning arrived, the cry had already taken on the quality of a half-remembered dream. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss it. She prepared her breakfast as usual, noting how the kettle seemed to take longer than usual to boil, as though the day itself were reluctant to begin. At the small grocer's later that morning, she found the air unusually brisk with conversation. Mrs. Ellington, who prided herself on knowing everything before anyone else, remarked rather loudly that she had slept sound as a bell, and went on to describe her night in unnecessary detail. Mr. Carter chimed in to agree, insisting that nothing had disturbed him, though his voice rose sharply at the end of the sentence. Miss Marple listened, her mild expression unchanged, and observed how often the word nothing was repeated. She made some innocuous remark about the early hour, and Mrs. Ellington laughed a little too quickly before changing the subject to the weather. It was mentioned, quite casually, that the wind had been particularly strange in the small hours, carrying sounds in peculiar ways. The conversation faltered at once, as though everyone had suddenly remembered an appointment elsewhere. Miss Marple paid for her purchases and departed, reflecting that when people hurried away from a topic, it was often because they had lingered over it too long in their own thoughts. The church bell rang later that morning with its usual steady assurance, calling the village together in a way that felt, on this particular day, more like an accounting than a comfort. Miss Marple took her customary seat and allowed her gaze to wander gently over the familiar faces. Mrs. Pritchard sat 2 rows ahead, her hymn book clasped tightly against her chest, her lips moving soundlessly as though she were reciting something other than the printed words. Miss Marple noticed how her fingers tightened whenever the congregation rose or sat, as though sudden movement unsettled her. Mr. Halloway, usually so attentive to his neighbors, stared fixedly at the back of the pew before him, his expression one of careful neutrality. As the service progressed, Miss Marple found herself less interested in the sermon than in the small adjustments of posture and glance that passed almost unnoticed. A cough here, a hurried smoothing of a sleeve there. When the vicar spoke of listening for still, small voices, a ripple of discomfort passed through the pews, subtle but undeniable. Miss Marple thought of the cry again and wondered how many others were doing the same. During the final hymn, she caught Mrs. Pritchard's eye for just a moment and saw something like a peal flicker there, before it vanished behind a resolute smile. Outside the church, the usual clusters formed, and conversation resumed with determined cheerfulness. Someone remarked upon the flowers by the gate, another upon the quality of the singing. Miss Marple stood listening as Mrs. Green mentioned, in a tone of forced lightness, that she had been awake very early and had heard the wind making all sorts of noises. The remark was met with a curious stillness, broken only when Mr. Halloway laughed shortly and said that country sounds could be very deceptive. Miss Marple noted that no one contradicted him, though several faces betrayed a different opinion. She walked home slowly, greeting acquaintances and receiving replies that were polite but distracted. At the corner, she paused to speak with young Susan from the post office, who confided that her mother had complained of a headache brought on by a restless night. Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, thinking how often physical discomfort accompanied unease of the mind. Passing Rosebank Cottage, she observed that the curtains were drawn more tightly than usual, though the day was brightening nicely. Such small deviations rarely meant much on their own, yet they had a habit of forming patterns if one was patient enough to wait. At home once more, Miss Marple sat by the window with her tea, reflecting on the morning's impressions. The cry itself remained vivid in her memory, not for its volume, but for its intention. It had sounded, she thought, as though it had been released deliberately, shaped to carry just far enough to be noticed and no further. She recalled a case from long ago in which a disturbance had been created not to summon help, but to provide an explanation. People, she had learned, were remarkably adept at constructing reasons after the fact, provided they were given something to build upon. As the afternoon wore on, visitors called with small errands and smaller confidences. Mrs. Blake mentioned that she had found her back door unlatched that morning and could not imagine how it had happened. Mr. Dent observed that his dog had barked at an unusual hour, though he had thought nothing of it at the time. Miss Marple listened kindly, offering no conclusions, merely encouragement to speak. Each remark was noted, weighed, and set aside, like pieces of a puzzle not yet ready to be assembled. When evening approached, the village settled once more into its habitual quiet. Lamps were lit, curtains drawn, and suppers prepared. Miss Marple watched as shadows lengthened across the lane, thinking again of the light she had seen before dawn. She wondered who had been awake, who had been listening, and who had decided that it was best to pretend otherwise. The cry lingered in her thoughts, no longer a mystery in itself, but a signpost pointing toward something deeper and far more deliberate. She smiled faintly as she prepared for bed, her mind alert beneath its gentle exterior. Villages, she knew, were very good at keeping secrets, but they were even better at revealing them to those who knew how to look. As she extinguished her lamp, Miss Marple reflected that the night had spoken plainly enough. The question now was, who had been most anxious to ensure that it would not be believed? And as darkness settled once more over the quiet houses, Miss Marple, smiling kindly, wondered why a single cry had already unsettled so many consciences. Chapter 2. There was a certain stiffness to the village that morning, as though everyone had risen with an unspoken agreement to behave exactly as usual. Miss Marple noticed it first at the gate, where Mrs. Dobson paused a fraction too long before offering her customary greeting, then hurried on as if late for an appointment she had not mentioned. Such moments, Miss Marple knew, were rarely accidental. They were the outward signs of thoughts best kept private. Her invitation to tea at Rosebank Cottage arrived just after breakfast, delivered by young Susan from the post office with the air of someone relieved to be passing on a responsibility. Eleanor Pritchard's handwriting was neat and careful, the letters formed with deliberate precision, as though disorder of any kind were unwelcome. Miss Marple accepted at once. Tea invitations, after all, were among the village's most effective methods of communication, and one ignored them at one's peril. Rosebank Cottage sat a little apart from the others, respectable but faintly tired, as though it required more attention than it received. Miss Marple arrived promptly and was shown into the sitting room, where Eleanor Pritchard stood waiting with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. James Pritchard rose from his chair a moment later, smoothing his jacket unnecessarily before offering his greeting. Miss Marple observed both siblings quietly, noting how they did not look at one another until politeness required it. Tea was poured with great care. Eleanor's hand was steady enough while lifting the pot, yet Miss Marple observed a slight tremor when she passed the sugar bowl to her brother. James thanked her with exaggerated cheerfulness and began at once to speak of trivial matters: the weather, the state of the garden, the difficulty of finding good help these days. Miss Marple listened, her expression mild, her attention fixed on the spaces between their words. As cups were filled, Eleanor remarked that she had not slept particularly well the night before, though she laughed as she said it, as if to dismiss the confession before it could be examined. James responded quickly, too quickly, by saying that he, on the other hand, had slept like a child. Miss Marple thought how often such declarations were made in the hope of convincing oneself. She commented gently that many people seemed restless of late, and Eleanor's fingers tightened around her saucer. Conversation drifted, as it always did, toward practical concerns. Eleanor spoke of repairs that would need attention soon, mentioning the roof and the aging plumbing with a faint sigh. James interjected that expenses had a way of mounting unexpectedly, especially when one was responsible for an old property. Miss Marple noticed how the word responsible lingered in the air, weighted with more than its usual meaning. She recalled a remark overheard at the grocer's about the Pritchards' finances and wondered how much truth lay beneath the gossip. At one point, James mentioned their late cousin almost casually, remarking that it was a pity she had never taken proper care of her affairs. Eleanor's hand faltered then, just for a moment, and a drop of tea spilled onto the saucer. She brushed it away at once, murmuring an apology that no one had requested. Miss Marple observed that it was not the mention of the cousin that had unsettled her, but something implied rather than spoken. Wills and promises, she thought, had a way of disturbing even the calmest household. There came a pause, and into it, Miss Marple introduced a remark that sounded quite innocent. She said she had been awake very early the previous morning and had noticed how still the village seemed. James laughed lightly and said that country nights were always quiet. Eleanor agreed, nodding a little too eagerly, before adding that she had retired early and heard nothing at all. Miss Marple sipped her tea and remarked that sounds could travel oddly when the air was clear. The effect was immediate. James set his cup down with a sharper clink than necessary and said that he had noticed a light burning late in the village, though he could not say where. Eleanor looked at him then, her expression flickering before she smoothed it away. Miss Marple noted the exchange carefully. A light seen but not acknowledged. A sound heard but denied. Such things rarely occurred in isolation. As the conversation resumed, Miss Marple observed the room itself. A lamp stood on the side table, its shade slightly askew, as though it had been adjusted in haste. A faint mark marred the carpet near the hearth, something that might once have been damp. Eleanor followed Miss Marple's gaze and shifted her chair just enough to block the view. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and remarked on the comfort of the room, filing the small gesture away for later consideration. There was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Linton from next door appeared with a plate of biscuits and the air of someone eager to linger. She spoke at once, remarking how surprised she had been to see a lamp lit so late at Rosebank Cottage 2 nights before. Eleanor replied that she must be mistaken, as they had all gone to bed early. Mrs. Linton laughed awkwardly and said she supposed she must have been confused. Miss Marple noticed how James did not meet either woman's eyes. Mrs. Linton stayed only a few minutes, yet her brief visit left the room distinctly cooler. Eleanor busied herself collecting cups, while James stood by the window staring out as though the garden held some urgent interest. Miss Marple rose to help and observed how Eleanor's composure seemed to rest on constant motion. Stillness, it appeared, made her uneasy. When at last Miss Marple took her leave, Eleanor pressed her hand a little too tightly, thanking her for coming as though the visit had been a test successfully endured. James accompanied her to the door, remarking with forced brightness that it had been pleasant to have company. Miss Marple replied that she had enjoyed it very much, and meant it, for she had learned a great deal. Walking home, she reflected on the afternoon's small revelations, the tremor in Eleanor's hand, the haste of James's assurances, the lamp that everyone wished to explain away. None of it amounted to anything conclusive, yet together they suggested a household under strain. Miss Marple thought how often such strain arose not from present difficulties, but from past decisions pressing insistently for acknowledgement. She paused by the hedge at the edge of the lane, recalling how the light she had seen before dawn had been extinguished so quickly. A lamp, she knew, could serve many purposes. It could guide, comfort, or deceive. It could also betray, illuminating what might otherwise remain hidden. The village had noticed that light, even if it pretended not to have done so. As she continued on her way, Miss Marple smiled to herself, her thoughts already arranging the afternoon's details into tentative patterns. The cry, the lamp, the unease around the subject of money and inheritance. These were not separate threads, but parts of a single fabric. Someone had been awake when they claimed to be asleep, alert when they professed ignorance. That evening, as dusk settled gently over the rooftops, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and considered the Pritchard household with renewed interest. She felt certain that whatever had been set in motion, there was far from resolved. Appearances, after all, required constant maintenance, and cracks had a way of widening when least expected. And as the village lights flickered on one by one, Miss Marple wondered why a single lamp, glimpsed and denied, should trouble her thoughts almost as much as the cry that should not have been heard. Chapter 3. No one ever arrived at the vicarage without a purpose, though many pretended otherwise, and Miss Marple was keenly aware of this as she walked up the neat gravel path just before noon. The roses by the door were in careful order, their blooms trimmed with a precision that suggested someone had recently needed the comfort of tidiness. She noted, too, that the curtains in the front room were drawn back farther than usual, as though the house wished to appear open, welcoming, and quite without secrets. Such efforts rarely went unnoticed by Miss Marple. Mrs. Vane, the vicar's wife, greeted her with warmth that was genuine yet faintly strained, the sort that came from entertaining more than one unexpected visitor already that morning. She ushered Miss Marple inside with a flurry of polite remarks about the weather and the difficulty of keeping dust at bay. Miss Marple responded pleasantly, allowing the conversation to unfold at its own pace, knowing that haste was the enemy of revelation. The sitting room was bright and orderly, though Miss Marple observed that a chair had been moved slightly out of alignment, as though someone had risen from it abruptly and not returned. They settled themselves, and Mrs. Vane poured tea while speaking of village matters, in a voice carefully modulated to sound unconcerned. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she had been very busy lately, as several parishioners seemed in need of counsel. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, remarking that unsettled times often drove people to seek reassurance where they could find it. Mrs. Vane agreed at once, her hand pausing briefly on the teapot before she resumed pouring. As they talked, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander, noting a folded handkerchief on the side table and a hymn book resting open beside it. Mrs. Vane followed her glance and smiled faintly, explaining that Mrs. Halloway had called earlier that week, feeling a little overwhelmed. The explanation came too smoothly, as though rehearsed. Miss Marple murmured something suitably kind and wondered what sort of overwhelm required a private visit rather than the comfort of public prayer. The vicar himself joined them shortly, apologizing for his lateness and speaking at once of parish duties and correspondence. Miss Marple listened with interest, observing how he avoided mentioning the early hours of the previous morning. When she remarked gently that many people seemed to be waking earlier than usual, he laughed and said that sleeplessness was common enough. Yet his eyes flickered toward his wife, who adjusted her cup in its saucer with unnecessary care. Conversation turned, as it so often did, to the peculiarities of village life. Miss Marple spoke of how small communities noticed changes quickly, even when they pretended not to. Mrs. Vane agreed, adding that rumors could be quite tiresome. She said this with a sigh that suggested she had heard more than she wished. Miss Marple thought of the cry again and wondered how many versions of it had already begun to circulate, unspoken but firmly imagined. There came a moment when the vicar mentioned locking up the church late one evening that week. He said it had been unusually dark, and that he had nearly forgotten his keys. Miss Marple observed how his voice slowed at that point, as though he were measuring each word. She remarked lightly that keys had a habit of going astray at inconvenient times. The vicar smiled, but the smile did not quite reach his eyes. Mrs. Vane rose to fetch more biscuits, and in her absence, the room seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple took the opportunity to comment on the peacefulness of the vicarage grounds at night, noting how sound carried clearly across the lawns. The vicar shifted in his chair and said that he slept very soundly, adding that he heard nothing at all in the early hours. Miss Marple inclined her head, accepting the statement without challenge, while privately noting how often such assurances were offered unprompted. When Mrs. Vane returned, she spoke briskly of practical matters, mentioning that someone had forgotten to close the side gate the other night. Miss Marple observed how she glanced at her husband as she said it. The vicar replied that it must have been the wind, though the gate was a heavy one. Miss Marple reflected that wind was a remarkably convenient explanation for many things, particularly when no one wished to examine them too closely. A brief silence followed, broken when Miss Marple remarked that she had always found village routines comforting, especially when they were observed faithfully. Mrs. Vane smiled and agreed, though her fingers twisted the edge of her napkin as she did so. She added that disruptions, however small, could feel quite alarming. Miss Marple thought how true that was, especially when the disruption hinted at something one would rather not acknowledge. As the visit drew on, the talk turned to Mrs. Pritchard, spoken of with polite concern. Mrs. Vane mentioned that she seemed very distressed at church, though she had said little. Miss Marple commented on how some people found it difficult to speak when their thoughts pressed too closely. The vicar nodded, saying that silence could be as revealing as confession. Miss Marple agreed, thinking of the village's collective insistence that nothing at all had happened. When Miss Marple finally rose to leave, Mrs. Vane accompanied her to the door, thanking her with a sincerity that suggested relief. The vicar shook her hand warmly, remarking that it was always pleasant to see her. Miss Marple replied that she had enjoyed the visit very much and hoped she had not interrupted anything important. Mrs. Vane laughed a little too quickly and said that nothing was ever interrupted at the vicarage. Outside, the afternoon light lay gently across the lawns, and the church bell chimed the hour with reassuring steadiness. Miss Marple walked away at an unhurried pace, her thoughts busy beneath her calm exterior. The vicarage, she reflected, was a place where many burdens were quietly deposited, and not all of them were easily set aside. Words spoken there were often chosen with care, yet even careful words left traces behind. As she passed the lich gate, she paused, recalling the mention of the unlocked gate and the forgotten keys. Such small lapses, she knew, were rarely random. They appeared when attention was divided, when the mind was elsewhere. Someone in the village had been distracted at precisely the wrong moment, and that distraction had consequences. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Green near the post office, who remarked that the vicarage had seemed very busy lately. Miss Marple agreed mildly, adding that people often sought guidance when they felt uncertain. Mrs. Green nodded, lowering her voice to say that she hoped everything was quite all right. Miss Marple smiled reassuringly, though she privately wondered what, exactly, Mrs. Green feared might not be. By the time evening settled in, Miss Marple had turned the day's impressions over many times. The careful answers, the hurried explanations, the way certain subjects drew a veil of politeness across the room, the cry, the lamp, the locked doors, and misplaced keys. All of it suggested a village straining to maintain its sense of order. She knew from experience that such strain could not last indefinitely. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple looked out once more at the quiet lane, considering how many eyes had been watching that night, even if they denied it now. Comforting routines had resumed, yet beneath them ran a current of unease that no amount of tidiness could quite dispel. And as she extinguished her light, Miss Marple found herself wondering who had come to the vicarage seeking reassurance, and what it was they feared might be revealed if the silence were ever broken. Chapter 4. The house on the lane had always been spoken of with a certain caution, as though its name alone required one to lower one's voice. Miss Marple became aware of this early that morning, when Mrs. Dobson mentioned it in passing and then immediately changed the subject to the price of eggs. Such swift diversions rarely went unnoticed. By the time Miss Marple set out for her walk, she had already decided that her path would take her past the Halloway residence. Not out of curiosity, she never admitted to such a thing, but because familiar sights had a way of revealing unfamiliar truths. The lane itself was quiet, bordered by hedges that had grown a little too freely, as though no one had quite found the time or inclination to keep them in check. Miss Marple walked slowly, her steps unhurried, allowing her eyes to take in every detail. The Halloway house emerged gradually, solid and respectable, yet faintly neglected, like a person who dressed well but slept poorly. One of the downstairs windows caught her attention at once. The frame bore the unmistakable signs of recent repair, the paint still faintly glossier than the rest. Miss Marple paused, gazing at it with mild interest, and wondered what circumstance required such prompt attention. Mrs. Halloway herself appeared in the doorway moments later, as though summoned by the weight of Miss Marple's regard. She greeted her with a polite smile, remarking on the pleasantness of the morning and inviting her in with the air of someone who felt it would be rude not to. Miss Marple accepted, noting how the invitation seemed to cost a little more effort than usual. The hall was cool and dim, and Miss Marple observed that a rug had been shifted slightly out of place, its edge curling upward as though someone had caught their foot on it in haste. They settled in the sitting room, where Mrs. Halloway spoke at once of domestic matters, explaining that the window repair had been necessary after a minor accident some weeks ago. Miss Marple listened attentively, her expression serene. She remarked gently that the paint still smelled quite fresh. Mrs. Halloway laughed lightly and said she preferred to have such things done properly. Miss Marple agreed, thinking how often properly was used to disguise urgency. As tea was brought in, Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Halloway poured with a practiced hand, yet avoided looking directly at her guest. The conversation drifted toward the village, and Mrs. Halloway mentioned how unsettled everyone seemed lately. Miss Marple observed that unsettled feelings often arose when routines were disturbed. Mrs. Halloway nodded, her lips tightening briefly, before she replied that she valued routine above all else. The words sounded rehearsed, as though she had repeated them to herself more than once. At one point, Miss Marple remarked on how quiet the lane could be at night, adding that even small sounds seemed magnified. Mrs. Halloway responded too quickly, saying that she was always a very sound sleeper. Miss Marple inclined her head, accepting the statement without comment, while privately noting how often people spoke of their sleep when no one had asked. She glanced about the room, observing a small table near the door upon which lay a pair of gloves and a folded scarf, arranged with unnecessary neatness. The talk was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Peters, a neighbor, who stopped by under the pretense of returning a borrowed tool. He remarked cheerfully that he had heard raised voices coming from the house earlier in the week and hoped everything was quite all right. Mrs. Halloway assured him at once that he must have been mistaken, that no voices had been raised at all. Miss Marple noticed how Mr. Peters looked from one woman to the other before murmuring an apology and taking his leave. His footsteps retreated down the path with unusual haste. When they were alone again, Mrs. Halloway resumed her seat, smoothing her skirt as though to restore order to the room. She spoke of her husband then, referring to him with a fondness that seemed carefully measured. Miss Marple observed that she spoke of him in the past tense more than once, correcting herself each time with a quick laugh. Such slips, Miss Marple knew, were rarely meaningless. The mind often moved ahead of the words, revealing what the speaker had not yet accepted. Miss Marple asked a few gentle questions about household arrangements, remarking on how much responsibility came with maintaining such a property. Mrs. Halloway agreed, adding that her husband had always handled the more difficult matters. There was a pause, and Miss Marple noticed how Mrs. Halloway's gaze lingered on the door leading to the back of the house. Miss Marple thought of the rug in the hall and wondered how often that door had been used in recent days. As the visit drew on, Miss Marple rose to take her leave, remarking on the pleasantness of the garden. Mrs. Halloway accompanied her outside, pointing out a section of the hedge that had grown particularly wild. Miss Marple observed how it might easily conceal someone passing along the side of the house, unseen. Mrs. Halloway laughed nervously and said that she supposed it might. The laughter faded too quickly to be entirely comfortable. Walking back down the lane, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Linton, who remarked in a hushed tone that she had heard voices arguing from the Halloway house on the night of the cry. She added that she had not wished to intrude. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, thinking how often people justified inaction with politeness. She asked casually what time Mrs. Linton had heard the voices. Mrs. Linton hesitated before answering, then said she could not be certain. Miss Marple thanked her and continued on her way, reflecting that uncertainty often arrived after the fact. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paused near the hedge opposite the Halloway house, pretending to admire the flowers while observing the repaired window more closely. The glass was new, set firmly in place, yet the latch bore a faint scratch, as though it had been forced or handled roughly. Miss Marple's eyes lingered there, her thoughts returning to the cry that had pierced the dawn. She wondered if the window had been broken before or after that sound had traveled across the village. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned home, her mind quietly busy. She poured herself tea and considered the patterns emerging. The hurried repairs, the slips of the tongue, the neighbors' half-remembered remarks, all suggested a night far less peaceful than anyone wished to admit. She thought of Mrs. Halloway's insistence on routine and order, and how such insistence often arose from a fear of chaos just beneath the surface. That night, as the village settled once more into darkness, Miss Marple listened carefully. Her window opened just enough to admit the cool air. No cry disturbed the silence, yet she felt certain that the house on the lane held echoes that had not yet faded. Someone there had acted in haste, and haste, she knew, left traces even when care was taken to erase them. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected that houses, like people, revealed their secrets in small ways. A repaired window, a misaligned rug, a word spoken too soon. The Halloway house had spoken quietly, but clearly enough for those willing to listen. And as she extinguished her lamp, Miss Marple found herself wondering whether the cry had been meant to draw attention away from that house, or toward it all along. Chapter 5. The letter arrived in the village as quietly as everything else did, yet its presence seemed to ripple outward in a way Miss Marple found most instructive. She first heard of it from Mrs. Dobson, who mentioned, quite casually, or so she claimed, that there had been some confusion at the post office that morning. A piece of correspondence, apparently, had been mislaid and then recovered, an occurrence rare enough in a village that prized order above all things. Miss Marple thanked her kindly for the information, noting how Mrs. Dobson lingered just long enough to ensure the remark had landed. Later that morning, Miss Marple encountered young Susan herself, who appeared flustered and apologetic, though no apology had been requested. She explained that a letter addressed to Mr. Halloway had been placed in the wrong box and only discovered after several hours. Miss Marple observed the way Susan's voice dipped when she mentioned the addressee, as though the name itself carried weight. She remarked gently that such things happened from time to time, and Susan nodded with visible relief, adding that the letter had been delivered at once the mistake was found. Miss Marple walked on, considering how a delay, however small, could unsettle those awaiting news. Letters, she knew, were vessels of anticipation, and anticipation often betrayed more than the message itself. By the time she reached the green, she had already heard two versions of the same story, each slightly altered by the teller's anxieties. That, in itself, was worth noting. The matter might have ended there, had it not been for the letter's sudden reappearance in conversation later that afternoon. Miss Marple had stopped by the village inn for a light lunch when she overheard Mr. Carter remark that James Pritchard had seemed unusually absorbed while reading something earlier that day. He added that James had read it twice before folding it away with great care. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her attention sharpened by the detail. People rarely read trivial letters more than once. It was not long before Miss Marple found herself invited, quite unexpectedly, to Rosebank Cottage once more. Eleanor Pritchard greeted her with a politeness that bordered on formality, as though determined to keep the visit within carefully defined bounds. James was present as well, seated near the window with a letter folded neatly beside him on the table. Miss Marple's eyes rested on it only briefly, yet she noted the quality of the paper and the unfamiliar hand that addressed the envelope. Conversation began with the usual pleasantries, though Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of strain. Eleanor spoke of household matters, her tone precise and measured. James contributed occasionally, though his attention seemed divided. At last, Eleanor remarked that there had been a bit of confusion at the post office, something she said with a laugh that sounded more like relief than amusement. James nodded, adding that mistakes were inevitable. Miss Marple agreed, observing mildly that some mistakes arrived at particularly inconvenient times. At this, James reached for the letter and passed it across the table, saying that Miss Marple might find it interesting, given her interest in village affairs. Miss Marple accepted it with thanks, noting how Eleanor's gaze followed the movement with barely concealed tension. The letter itself was brief, written in a careful hand, and spoke of a meeting that could no longer be postponed. It made reference to a decision that must be finalized before matters grew more complicated. Miss Marple returned it at once, her expression unchanged. She remarked lightly that the writer seemed very determined. James agreed, though his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor interjected that people often dramatize such things unnecessarily. Miss Marple smiled and said that sometimes drama arose when patience had worn thin. Eleanor's hand tightened on her cup, and for a moment the room felt distinctly smaller. As the visit continued, Miss Marple allowed the conversation to wander toward familiar topics: repairs, expenses, the upkeep of old houses. James spoke at length about unexpected costs, his tone edging toward complaint. Miss Marple observed that he avoided Eleanor's eyes while speaking, as though wary of contradiction. She thought again of the letter's phrasing and wondered how long a decision could be delayed before it forced itself into the open. A knock at the door interrupted them, and Mrs. Linton entered with the air of someone eager to share news. She remarked at once that she had heard about the letter and hoped everything was quite all right. Eleanor replied sharply that there was nothing to discuss. Mrs. Linton apologized, though her curiosity was far from satisfied, and took her leave after only a few minutes. Miss Marple noticed how James watched the door close, his expression thoughtful. When Mrs. Linton had gone, Eleanor busied herself clearing cups, while James remained seated, staring at the letter as though it might offer further guidance. Miss Marple commented gently that written words often carried more weight than spoken ones, especially when they concerned matters long left unresolved. James looked up at her then, his expression guarded, and said that some things were best settled privately. Miss Marple agreed, adding that privacy could be difficult to maintain in a village where everyone listened so carefully. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple observed a small stack of papers on the sideboard, among them an envelope bearing a similar hand to the letter James held. Eleanor noticed her glance and moved slightly to obscure them. Miss Marple thanked them both for their hospitality and departed, her mind already arranging the afternoon's impressions. Outside, she encountered Mrs. Green, who remarked that she had heard talk of a letter that might explain a great deal if only it were read aloud. Miss Marple smiled and said that letters rarely explained anything without creating new questions. Mrs. Green nodded, lowering her voice to say that money was often at the heart of such matters. Miss Marple agreed, thinking how money had a way of sharpening decisions that might otherwise be postponed indefinitely. As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected on the letter's timing. Mislaid, delayed, then suddenly delivered. Such a sequence could hardly be accidental in a place where routine ruled. She recalled the cry in the night and the light glimpsed and denied, and wondered whether the letter had been meant to arrive before or after those events. Timing, she knew, was everything. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paused at the post office once more, engaging Susan in gentle conversation. Susan mentioned that the letter's return address had been unfamiliar, though she could not recall it clearly. Miss Marple thanked her and thought how unfamiliar names often concealed very familiar motives. She left with the sense that the letter had traveled a longer distance than the miles suggested. As evening settled in, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the village prepare for the night. Lamps were lit, curtains drawn, and doors secured with habitual care. She thought of the decision mentioned in the letter and how such decisions rarely existed in isolation. They were the culmination of many smaller choices, each one justified at the time. She poured herself tea and considered how the letter had unsettled those who touched it. Like a stone dropped into still water, Eleanor's tension, James's guardedness, the neighbor's eager speculation, all pointed towards something that could no longer be contained by polite silence. The village, for all its calm, was leaning forward, waiting. As darkness deepened, Miss Marple recalled the letter's final line, written with particular firmness. It cannot be delayed any longer. She wondered what would have happened had it arrived earlier or later. She wondered, too, whether the cry in the night had been meant to distract from the letter's arrival or to hasten its consequences. When at last she prepared for bed, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty settle over her. The letter was not merely a piece of correspondence. It was a marker, a sign that events had reached their turning point. Someone in the village had been pressed to act, and action once taken could not be undone. As she extinguished her light, Miss Marple smiled faintly, her thoughts calm but intent. The letter had been found, yet its true message remained obscured, folded neatly away like the paper itself. And as the village slipped into uneasy sleep, Miss Marple wondered whose decision had finally been carried out, and what price had already been paid to ensure it remained unspoken. Chapter 6. By the time Miss Marple reached the village inn that morning, it was already apparent that the air was thick with unspoken corrections. People were speaking freely enough, yet each sentence seemed to arrive accompanied by a swift glance, as though to check who might be listening too closely. Miss Marple paused just inside the doorway, allowing the warmth of the room and the murmur of voices to settle around her. Patterns, she knew, were best observed when one did not announce one's attention. She took her usual seat near the window, where she could see both the room and the lane beyond, and ordered a modest lunch. Mrs. Hall, bustling behind the counter, remarked cheerfully that it was good to see familiar faces about again, as though normality had merely taken a short holiday. Miss Marple smiled in agreement, noting how Mrs. Hall's cheerfulness seemed slightly forced, her voice rising a touch too brightly at the end of each sentence. Conversation flowed around her in gentle currents. Mr. Carter was holding forth on the difficulty of keeping track of time these days, remarking that the clocks all seemed to disagree with one another. Mrs. Dent laughed and said that hers had stopped altogether the night before last. Miss Marple listened with interest. Broken clocks, she reflected, had a habit of appearing at inconvenient moments. She remarked mildly that one should never rely too heavily on a single timepiece, a comment that drew a few thoughtful nods. The talk shifted to the weather, then back again to village routines. Someone mentioned hearing a door close late one evening, though they could not recall which night. Another spoke of a latch that had not quite caught, allowing a door to swing open unexpectedly. Miss Marple noted how these remarks clustered around the same narrow window of time, circling it without quite settling. She stirred her tea thoughtfully, considering how memory sharpened or dulled itself according to necessity. As plates were cleared, Mrs. Green leaned closer and lowered her voice, remarking that it was odd how 3 different people claimed to have locked up for the night, yet no one could say exactly which door they had secured. Miss Marple agreed that it was curious, adding that people often remembered actions they believed they ought to have taken rather than those they actually did. Mrs. Green laughed softly, though her eyes remained serious. At the far end of the room, James Pritchard sat alone, nursing a cup of tea that had long since cooled. Miss Marple observed him quietly. He listened intently to the surrounding talk, though he did not join in, and each time the conversation edged toward the night of the cry, his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple thought how vigilance often betrayed a fear of omission rather than commission. When James eventually rose to leave, Miss Marple followed a few moments later, her departure timed to appear entirely coincidental. Outside, she commented pleasantly on the briskness of the air. James agreed at once, adding that it was the sort of weather that carried sound remarkably well. The remark hung between them, uninvited. Miss Marple inclined her head and said that she had noticed that herself. James smiled, though the smile appeared to cost him some effort, and soon took his leave. Miss Marple continued on her way, turning over the exchange in her mind. People rarely volunteered observations unless they were anxious to place them somewhere safe. She thought again of the repeated mentions of doors and locks, of actions remembered collectively but imprecisely. Such uncertainty, she knew, was fertile ground for invention. That afternoon, she accepted an invitation to take tea at Mrs. Dent's, where the talk was lively and the biscuits plentiful. Mrs. Dent remarked that she had found her spare key in an unusual place that morning, tucked behind a jar she rarely used. She laughed it off, yet her eyes searched the room as she spoke. Miss Marple commented gently that spare keys often wandered when one was distracted. Mrs. Dent nodded, her laughter fading. As they talked, Miss Marple observed a small bruise on Mrs. Dent's wrist, partly concealed by her sleeve. Mrs. Dent noticed the glance and hastened to explain that she had knocked it while closing the back door one evening. Miss Marple murmured sympathetically, thinking how many doors had featured in recent explanations. She reflected that doors marked transitions, and transitions were seldom as simple as they appeared. On her way home, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Linton, who spoke of having found a key on the lane earlier that week. She said she had assumed it belonged to someone passing through and had left it where it lay. Miss Marple asked casually what sort of key it was. Mrs. Linton hesitated, then said she could not quite remember. Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, noting how often memory failed when precision became inconvenient. By late afternoon, the village seemed to hum with restrained energy, as though everyone were waiting for something to settle. Miss Marple sat by her window, watching people pass, each carrying their own version of events. She thought again of the cry that had begun it all, and how quickly it had been absorbed into a web of explanations. People, she knew, preferred familiar confusion to uncomfortable clarity. As evening approached, she took a short walk, pausing near the green where several villagers stood chatting. Someone remarked that it was odd how 3 people recalled hearing a door close, yet only one remembered locking it. Another laughed and said that such details hardly mattered. Miss Marple listened, her expression serene, and considered how such discrepancies mattered very much indeed. Returning home, she poured herself tea and began, quite unconsciously, to arrange the day's details into a mental sequence. The repeated references to doors, keys, and locks formed a pattern too consistent to be ignored. Someone had wanted a door secured or unsecured at a particular moment. Someone else had wished to remember having taken precautions, whether or not they had done so. Miss Marple recalled a case from years before, in which a single misplaced key had unraveled a carefully constructed account. She thought of James's remark about sound carrying, of Mrs. Dent's wandering spare key, of Mrs. Linton's forgotten find. Each detail, taken alone, was insignificant. Together, they suggested preparation, movement, and a need for access at just the right time. As dusk settled, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty take shape. The village was not confused. It was rehearsing. Stories had been adjusted, responsibilities blurred, and memories softened at the edges. Such collective behavior rarely occurred without cause. She knew that the truth lay not in what was remembered, but in what everyone had agreed to forget. She rose to close her curtains, pausing to look once more down the lane. A door opened briefly in the distance, light spilling out before it was shut again. Miss Marple watched thoughtfully, considering how easily light could be mistaken for reassurance when it was in fact a signal. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected that the pattern was nearly complete. Doors had been opened and closed, keys had changed hands, and sound had been carefully accounted for. Only one piece remained uncertain. Who had needed that access most of all? And as the village settled into its uneasy quiet, Miss Marple, smiling gently, knew that the pattern was nearly complete, but one piece still refused to lie flat. Chapter 7. Miss Marple had learned long ago that polite visits, undertaken with no apparent purpose, were often the most revealing of all. That afternoon, when she set out for Rosebank Cottage once more, she did so under the entirely respectable pretext of returning a book James Pritchard had once lent her. The book rested lightly in her hands, yet she was quite aware that it was not the printed words inside that made the visit necessary. It was the conversation that would follow, and more importantly, the silences. Rosebank Cottage looked much as it had before, though Miss Marple noticed at once that the curtains were half drawn, despite the brightness of the day. She rang the bell and waited, listening to the faint sounds of movement within. James answered the door himself, his expression one of polite surprise that settled quickly into something more guarded. He ushered her inside with careful courtesy, remarking that Eleanor was out and would be sorry to have missed her. Miss Marple replied that she was sure Eleanor was busy, and that she would not stay long. They sat in the sitting room, the atmosphere oddly formal for a house shared by siblings. Miss Marple returned the book with thanks, commenting on how interesting she had found it. James smiled faintly and said that he was glad of it, though he did not ask her opinion. Miss Marple observed that his hands were restless, smoothing the arm of his chair as though seeking reassurance from its solidity. She began with a remark about the village, noting how quickly routines seemed to reassert themselves after any disturbance. James agreed readily, saying that people preferred not to dwell on unpleasantness. Miss Marple inclined her head and said that dwelling was rarely productive, though reflection often was. James's smile tightened slightly, and he shifted in his seat. Gradually, and with great gentleness, Miss Marple guided the conversation toward practical matters. She spoke of old houses and the responsibilities they imposed, mentioning how caretaking could become burdensome over time. James responded with more animation, speaking of repairs, finances, and the difficulty of meeting expectations that had been set long ago. Miss Marple listened attentively, noting how his voice gained energy when he spoke of obligation rather than affection. At one point, she remarked that such responsibilities often fell unevenly within families. James laughed shortly and said that people rarely understood the strain until they were living with it. Miss Marple agreed, adding that strain could cause people to make decisions they might otherwise postpone. The word decisions seemed to echo in the room. James's gaze flickered toward the sideboard, where a neat stack of papers lay arranged with deliberate precision. There was a pause, and Miss Marple filled it with a small observation. She mentioned how sound carried so clearly in the early hours, particularly when the air was still. James responded almost at once, saying that the village was always quiet at night. The speed of his reply was notable. Miss Marple smiled kindly and said that quiet could be deceptive, that even the smallest disturbance could feel magnified. James's fingers tightened on the armrest, then relaxed. She leaned back slightly and spoke in a tone that was conversational rather than accusatory. She said that she had been thinking about the cry that had woken her that morning, and how curious it was that so many people had heard nothing at all. James's face remained composed, yet Miss Marple observed a faint change in his breathing. He said that memory was unreliable, especially when one was half asleep. Miss Marple agreed, adding that people often remembered what best suited them afterward. The conversation drifted again, touching briefly on Eleanor's health and the effort she put into maintaining the household. James spoke of his sister with careful respect, emphasizing her devotion and sensitivity. Miss Marple listened, noting how he spoke as though Eleanor were something to be managed rather than understood. She remarked gently that sensitivity could be both a strength and a vulnerability. James nodded, though his expression suggested he had little patience for either. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the window, commenting on the garden and the way the hedge provided privacy from the lane. James joined her, standing a little too close. She remarked, almost idly, that such hedges could also conceal movement, especially at night. James laughed lightly and said that the village was hardly a place for secrets. Miss Marple smiled and replied that villages were built on them. Returning to her seat, she allowed her voice to soften further. She spoke of how difficult it could be to live with unresolved matters, particularly those involving money and expectation. James stiffened, then said that such matters were best handled decisively. Miss Marple nodded, saying that decisiveness often appeared admirable, though it sometimes left little room for reconsideration. James looked at her then, truly looked, and for a brief moment his composure wavered. There came a knock at the door, sharp and unexpected. Both of them started, though James recovered quickly. Mrs. Green entered with apologies, explaining that she had come to return a dish Eleanor had lent her. She glanced between Miss Marple and James, her curiosity barely disguised, and remarked that it was good to see company. James replied that Miss Marple had just been leaving. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and said that she had enjoyed the visit very much. Mrs. Green lingered only a moment, yet her presence seemed to shift the air in the room. As she left, she remarked casually that people were still talking about that odd cry the other morning. James responded with a dismissive laugh, saying that people talked about everything. Miss Marple observed how his laughter faded the instant the door closed. She rose at last to take her leave, thanking James for his time. He accompanied her to the door, speaking with forced brightness about the weather and the changing season. Miss Marple paused on the threshold and turned to him, her expression gentle but intent. She said that she hoped everything was quite settled now, that whatever decisions had been troubling the household were behind them. James met her gaze, his face carefully composed. He said that some decisions once made could not be revisited. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind. She replied that that was true, and that such finality often left its mark in unexpected ways. For a moment, James seemed about to speak further. Then he merely wished her good afternoon and closed the door. Walking away, Miss Marple reflected on the visit with quiet satisfaction. James had not confessed anything, nor had he needed to. His defensiveness, his eagerness to justify action, his insistence on finality, all spoke more loudly than any admission. She thought of the letter, the lamp, the keys, and the cry, and how neatly they now aligned with his account of burden and resolve. As she reached the lane, she encountered Mrs. Linton, who remarked that James Pritchard had seemed quite unsettled of late. Miss Marple agreed, saying that responsibility could weigh heavily on some people. Mrs. Linton lowered her voice and added that she hoped everything was truly over. Miss Marple smiled faintly, thinking how often people mistook exposure for resolution. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat by her window, replaying the conversation in her mind. James's words had been carefully chosen, yet his timing had been less so. He had offered denials before questions, explanations before accusations. Such behavior, Miss Marple knew, was rarely the sign of innocence. It was the sign of someone bracing themselves against an unspoken truth. As evening drew near, the village seemed to hold its breath once more. Doors closed, curtains were drawn, and lamps glowed steadily behind the windows. Miss Marple observed it all with calm attention, her thoughts settling into a clear and unmistakable shape. She felt certain now not only of what had happened, but of why. She poured herself tea and considered how often decisive people underestimated the power of small observations. A tremor in the hand, a hurried laugh, a phrase spoken too soon, these were the true witnesses, and they could not be persuaded to forget. James Pritchard had acted out of certainty, believing he could control the narrative that followed. As darkness fell, Miss Marple looked once more toward Rosebank Cottage, its windows glowing warmly against the dusk. She knew that warmth could be deceptive, that comfort was often the final disguise. The village might still be murmuring, uncertain and uneasy, but the truth had already surfaced, clear and unavoidable. And as the first stars appeared above the quiet roofs, Miss Marple felt quite sure that the village would not sleep easily another night. Chapter 8. The morning arrived with a brightness that felt almost deliberate, as though the village were determined to present its most respectable face. Miss Marple noticed this at once when she drew back her curtains and saw how carefully swept the lane appeared, how promptly doors opened and closed in accordance with habit. Such order, she knew, often preceded disruption rather than prevented it. She dressed with particular care that day, not out of vanity, but because occasions of clarity deserved a certain propriety. Word had traveled, as it always did, that Miss Marple had asked several people to call at Rosebank Cottage that afternoon. The invitation was spoken of as a misunderstanding to be cleared up, nothing more, yet the village hummed softly with anticipation. Mrs. Green remarked that it was good someone was finally putting things straight, while Mrs. Dobson wondered aloud whether such gatherings ever ended comfortably. Miss Marple listened kindly to both, thinking how truth rarely concerned itself with comfort. Rosebank Cottage filled gradually, chairs arranged with polite precision, teacups laid out as though this were an ordinary social call. Eleanor Pritchard sat rigidly near the hearth, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. Mrs. Halloway took a seat by the window, her gaze fixed firmly outside. The vicar and his wife arrived together, their manner calm but attentive. James Pritchard came last, offering a genial greeting that failed to disguise the tension beneath it. Miss Marple observed them all with gentle composure and waited until everyone was settled before she spoke. She began, as she always did, with something entirely unthreatening. She remarked on how fortunate the village was to enjoy such peace most of the time, how routines and familiar faces provided reassurance. Several people nodded, grateful for the tone. Then she said, quite conversationally, that disruptions, however small, had a way of revealing what lay beneath that reassurance. The room grew very still. Miss Marple spoke of the cry in the night, not as an accusation, but as an oddity that had unsettled the village. She noted how curious it was that so many people had been awake enough to deny hearing it. A faint rustle passed through the room. She went on to mention the lights seen and extinguished, the doors remembered as locked, the keys recalled only afterward. Each detail was presented gently, almost fondly, yet their accumulation weighed heavily. She turned then to the letter, describing its delay, its urgency, and its reference to a decision that could no longer wait. She did not name its contents, only observed how it had unsettled those who touched it. James shifted in his chair, his expression tightening. Eleanor glanced at him, then quickly away. Miss Marple noticed both movements and continued calmly. She spoke next of small domestic details. The freshly painted window at the Halloway house, the misaligned rug, the hedge that concealed movement. Mrs. Halloway's lips pressed together, her composure fraying at the edges. Miss Marple said how houses, like people, often revealed haste, even when order was restored afterward. The vicar nodded slowly as though recognizing a truth he had hoped not to face. Then Miss Marple paused, letting the silence settle. When she spoke again, her voice was kind but firm. She said that the village had not been confused at all. It had been guided. The cry, she explained, had not been a plea, but a signal, a sound intended to travel just far enough to draw attention outward, away from a very particular place and moment. Several people inhaled sharply, though no one spoke. She turned her gaze to James Pritchard at last. She spoke of burden and responsibility, of resentment quietly nurtured, of a belief that decisive action could resolve everything neatly. She said that the letter had demanded a meeting, one that would have exposed arrangements best kept hidden. The cry had created confusion, the light had suggested vigilance elsewhere, and the unlocked door had provided opportunity. James's face had grown pale, though he remained outwardly composed. Miss Marple went on, explaining how James had staged disorder to disguise intention, relying on the village's eagerness to explain things away. He had known exactly how people would respond, how they would remember locking doors, how they would trust routine over doubt. The cry, she said, had given everyone something to talk about, instead of what truly mattered. It had worked for a time. Eleanor let out a small sound then, something between a breath and a sob. She looked at her brother with an expression of dawning comprehension. Miss Marple addressed her gently, saying that Eleanor had not been part of the planning, only the silence afterward. Eleanor's eyes filled and she nodded faintly, her hands trembling at last. James rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He attempted a laugh, saying that this was all speculation, cleverly arranged but entirely unfounded. Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. She remarked that speculation did not account for the timing of the cry, the letter's urgency, or the scratches on the window latch, nor did it explain why his denials had always arrived before the questions. The room seemed to contract around them. Mrs. Green murmured something about having wondered all along. Mrs. Halloway stared at the floor, her silence heavy with recognition. James's composure finally gave way, his voice sharpening as he insisted that he had only meant to protect what was rightfully his, that things had gone further than intended. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her expression unchanged. When he fell silent, she spoke once more, quietly. She said that villages endured because people believed in order, in kindness, and in the small rules that governed daily life. Those beliefs could be manipulated, but not indefinitely. Truth, she observed, had a way of asserting itself through the smallest cracks. A tremor, a hurried word, a light extinguished too quickly. There was no drama after that, only a subdued settling, as though something long held in suspension had finally been allowed to fall into place. James sank back into his chair, the certainty that had driven him drained away. Eleanor wept softly, comforted by Mrs. Vane. The vicar stepped forward, his manner grave but compassionate. Miss Marple rose, signaling gently that the moment had passed. She remarked that matters would now be handled properly, and that the village could at last return to its routines with clearer consciences. No one contradicted her. They departed quietly one by one, their footsteps subdued, as though mindful of the space they left behind. Later, as dusk settled over the lane, Miss Marple sat by her window once more, a cup of tea cooling at her side. The village seemed different, though nothing visible had changed. Lamps were lit, doors closed, and the familiar hush descended. Yet beneath it lay a sense of release, the easing that followed long-held tension. She thought again of the cry in the night and how it had been meant to mislead. It had done the opposite, drawing attention not outward but inward, to the careful arrangements and unspoken resentments that could no longer be ignored. Villages, she reflected, remembered such lessons quietly, carrying them forward in the way they listened a little more closely afterward. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The truth had emerged not through force, but through patience, observation, and an understanding of human nature that never failed her. The village would sleep more soundly now, not because nothing had happened, but because what had happened was finally understood. And as the last light went out along the lane, Miss Marple knew that the cry in the night had done its work at last, not as a signal of deception, but as the beginning of clarity and the end of a darkness that had believed itself safely concealed. End of story 500 words. The days that followed settled gently back into their accustomed rhythm, though Miss Marple observed with quiet interest that the village moved a little more thoughtfully than before. Doors were still opened and closed, tea was still poured at the proper hours, and greetings were exchanged with the same familiar warmth. Yet beneath these routines lay a new attentiveness, as though everyone had learned, without quite admitting it, that small things deserved closer notice. Rosebank Cottage grew quieter. Eleanor Pritchard remained there, moving through the rooms with a subdued grace, attended by neighbors who brought casseroles and spoke kindly without asking questions. Miss Marple called once, offering nothing more than companionship. Eleanor thanked her with genuine feeling, and though little was said, Miss Marple sensed that the weight of silence had at last been lifted. Understanding, even when painful, had a way of restoring balance. The house on the lane no longer drew cautious glances. Its windows remained whole, its hedge trimmed back just enough to let the light through. Mrs. Halloway was seen walking more often, her posture straighter, her expression less guarded. The village, which had once strained to look away, now allowed itself the relief of clarity. It spoke less, but listened more. At the vicarage, routines resumed with renewed steadiness. Mrs. Vane remarked one afternoon that people seemed calmer, as though a long-held breath had finally been released. Miss Marple agreed, saying that peace was rarely the absence of disturbance, but the presence of truth. The vicar nodded, thoughtful, and the conversation drifted to other matters. As for the cry in the night, it was spoken of only rarely now, and always with a certain restraint. It had become part of the village's quiet history, a reminder rather than a mystery. Miss Marple reflected that such moments were never entirely forgotten, nor should they be. They served as gentle warnings, teaching without lecturing, lingering without intruding. One evening, as Miss Marple sat by her window watching the last of the daylight fade, she poured herself a cup of tea and considered how easily things might have remained unresolved. A cry dismissed as imagination, a letter mislaid, a lamp explained away. Any one of these could have allowed the truth to slip quietly into obscurity. Yet people, she knew, were never quite as successful at forgetting as they hoped. The village settled into sleep that night with a deeper calm than it had known for some time. Miss Marple listened to the silence, attentive as always, and found it honest. No sounds pressed themselves upon the darkness, no lights flickered and vanished. What remained was simply the night, undisturbed and unafraid. She smiled faintly as she prepared for bed, her thoughts serene. Mysteries, she reflected, were rarely about cleverness alone. They were about patience, about noticing what others overlooked, and about understanding how fear and certainty could lead people astray. It was not brilliance that solved them, but familiarity with human nature in all its small, revealing habits. As she extinguished her lamp, Miss Marple felt a gentle satisfaction settle over her. The village had been reminded of itself, of its strengths, its vulnerabilities, and its quiet capacity for truth. Morning would come, as it always did, bringing with it chores, conversations, and the comforting continuity of ordinary life. And somewhere in that ordinariness, Miss Marple knew, lay the real safeguard against darkness. The simple act of paying attention and the courage, when necessary, to listen to what should not have been heard.